Alright, in this video I'm going to show you how you can make this car burnout animation using launch control to animate and EmberGen to simulate. Now don't worry if you don't own EmberGen, you can get it free for 2 weeks just by signing up with your email. No payment method is needed, and this will allow you to open up my EmberGen file yourself and export some cool VDBs. Now as well as this, I'm going to show you how you can render nearly 100 times faster by changing some of Blender's default settings to render volumes a lot quicker. So let's get into it. Alright, so to start off with, this is the car that I'm going to be using. It's by someone called Jane_CGI on Gumroad, and it's a free model of this car, super detailed, and this car is perfect for the type of animation we're going to be doing. So if you do want to follow along with this exact car, it's janecgi.gumroad.com, and there it will take you to this profile, and then you can get these free models, and then maybe you want to support the creator as well and get some of these other models. Alright, so now I'm in my Blender file, and you can see I've got my animation running with the car here. Nice and cool. And I've also textured the car and lit the scene how I want. Now, I did animate this using Launch Control. Now, Launch Control is a paid add-on which basically automatically rigs cars and allows you to animate across a path that you can create, but it also allows for some really cool custom controls. So for example, if I hop into pose mode, I can change everything about the car, the wiggle, maybe I want the back to slide out. So everything is controlled using these controllers, and it allows for some really cool sort of animations that you can do. Maybe you just want one wheel to move, maybe you just want the front to move, everything you could ever want, you can pretty much do with launch control in terms of car animation. And it also has really cool control with the camber on the wheels, how much wheel wobble you want, even auto drift, which is pretty cool. And it just allows total freedom of control. So I originally animated this off a blank curve, so I just got a straight curve and then I went about animating this. Now I spoke to Daniel, who is the owner of Launch Control, if we could set up a preset so that anybody who wants to buy Launch Control or who already has it but wants to do this animation can use it. So once you've rigged your car, you can go here and there's going to be a Burnout 02. So let's just add in another car. So Launch Control actually comes with some free cars that you can use in your animations. So I'm going to use this Porsche one just to demonstrate how the presets work. So if you click on the Porsche and you go over to your Porsche collection, and once you've renamed everything which is supposed to be the name, so if you actually come here to the quick tag tool, you'll see what everything needs to be named. And if you then hit rig, you'll get a curve already animated like so you know it's working. But then if you want to use my animation, you can click on this box here, click Burnout 2, and then press animate again, and it will give you this exact same scene just with a Porsche, which is super neat. So let's show you from behind. So you see it's got that wobble, and then they both drift off into the distance. Super cool. So if you do want to do it with the Porsche instead of the dragster, it will work just as well. So let's just unrig this vehicle, and I'll just unlink this from the scene. And now we can go about setting up this car to then be imported into EmberGen. We've got our car animation here, and what we can do now is export this as an FBX. Now Launch Control does have an export function. So if you go to, well, first I'm going to need to get my car. So it does have an export function, so you can export it using the quick export option here, and it is quite good this because you can actually change the amount of subframes that you want, which basically makes the animation bake a little bit more detailed. But for this example, I just went old school and just exported by going to File, Export. Now, when you're exporting to EmberGen, it's good to think of what you're going to need. So we're doing a burnout, right? So we're definitely going to need the back of the car and the wheel. And the reason for this is because the smoke would interact with the back of the car, right? So we're going to need that geometry to then tell EmberGen that the smoke needs to impact the back of the car. As well as that, we're going to need the wheels so that we get that spin coming off the wheels as well. So to start off with, I'm just going to select everything that I need to export. So all the back of the car, the back wheels, and that looks pretty good. I suggest when you're selecting stuff, just isolate it just so you know that everything is being selected that you want. And that looks pretty good. So once you've got this, you go to File, Export, FBX, and from here, you're going to want to click Selected Objects, and you're going to want to come down to the animation, remove all NLA strips, and remove all actions. The reason for this is I think it takes like all animations into account rather than just the ones that it specifically needs, I think. The Django effects team basically suggested that all animations coming from Blender should do this, so I just do it, but I'm pretty sure that's what it does. But if you do that, you'll be pretty much set for the next part. So let's jump into EmberGen and get something simulated. Alright, so now we're in EmberGen, and if you've never set foot in this software, I'm going to explain it briefly, but not a deep dive into it. Django Effects, who actually own EmberGen, do some great tutorials on their YouTube channel, so if you are struggling, I would check them out. Now, I'm not going to be going into every detail of this simulation, but I will be giving it for free on my Discord, which will be in the description if you want to try this out yourself. To start off with, the first things that you need in any software is that you need an emission and you need a domain for that emission to occur in. From there, you can start adding effectors, which would be your geometry and your forces. So let's start off with the geometry. So I've imported my FBX. Now I've actually imported everything just for the sake of this tutorial. And the first thing that I've done is scaled and center to fit, right? The reason for this is that EmberGen doesn't really like Blender scaling, so if you do import it, it's normally tiny. So if you scale and center to fit and just make it bigger, it's just a lot easier to work with. And now you may be wondering, well, won't that affect the volume once you bring it into Blender? And yes, it does, unless you take this transform and plug it into the export VDB. And this will basically scale your VDB down by the amount that you scaled your car up. So then it balances out. So there's one other thing which is a little bit tricky when you're importing into EmberGen, and that is that it takes into account the frame rate of your scene in Blender. Now, EmberGen operates in a 60 FPS file, right? So if you have 24 FPS or 30 FPS, it gets a little bit tricky. Now, going past my transform, you'll see I have an override FPS button, right? And this basically allows me to really set the FPS in the scene. So I've set my FPS at 30, but I just said EmberGen operates in 60, and that is completely fine. So what you do is you'll set your FPS at 30, right? And you'll set your time step, basically the FPS in EmberGen, to something which is dividable by your frame rate. So for example, my 60 Hz frame rate is divisible by 30 by 2, right? Now, the way you get around this is you go to your export VDB and you'll do a frame stride of 2. This basically divides your EmberGen FPS by 2 to equal your scene FPS as 30 FPS. If you had a 24 frame per second scene, you'll have to set 24 FPS in the geometry and then set 72 Hertz in the time step of your simulation and then set frame stride of 3. A little bit complicated, I know, but it's just to get the right frame rate for your scene, because obviously if your smoke is going quicker than your actual scene is, it's going to look a little bit weird. But that is everything you need to know about the geometry. That's probably the hardest part of EmberGen, is just getting your head around that. So hopefully you understood that, but leave a comment in the description if you are struggling. So anyway, now I've got my geometry, I can plug that into a collider. Now this is another node you can add, and to get a node you just right click and then you could search collider. And you can click on it, you can set how much you want to kill it by, you could change like the velocity transfer, loads of stuff. And then once you've got your collider, you'll then need to add that to the simulation. So you're basically telling the simulation, look, here's a collider, use this to affect the smoke. Super simple stuff. So going on to the emissions, I've got two shapes, which are literally just like cylinders, so that it's 2 meters by 1 meter. And these are basically on the wheel. Now I haven't parented these to the wheels, but I have animated them so that they follow the wheels pretty much exactly. So if I actually play this simulation for you, I can show you what it looks like. You can see this is what it looks like. And then once it goes out of the domain, it will reset and the smoke doesn't go past the domain. So that's what the emission does. It's basically a cylinder and that's pretty much it. Now, if you're wondering how I got the spin, there's kind of a few ways you can go about it. So not only are my wheels spinning, which will then start spinning the smoke because it's a collider, but I also have a force being applied. So as well as plugging in my emitters into my emitter here, I've also got a force being applied into the emission as well. So this force is basically a line which has a bit of twist onto it. This twist is actually going the wrong way, but it actually gave quite a nice effect for the smoke when I was actually testing this. So that's just a really handy way of getting like some wind effects or getting smoke to move in a way which is a little bit unnatural. You can also use a noise texture as well. Now, a noise texture is basically used to add detailing to your smoke, but looking at references, burnout smoke is normally quite soft. So if I turn on this forced noise, you'll start to see it gets a little bit more sort of, I don't know the word, turbulent, I guess. But I actually turn that off, but I'm going to leave it in the file just in case people want to play with it. Now, in the emitter volume, this is basically where you control how much smoke is going to be emitted, if you want fire emitted. So to start off with, I've actually animated how much smoke I wanted, and I've also completely removed any fuel, and fuel is basically what adds fire. So here on the green slot here, you can see how it's animated, and you'll see this number over here on the left slowly rises as it starts drifting. Well, as it starts burning out. And then towards the end, it starts feathering back off as the wheels get a little bit more grip and it's not spinning and burning out on the floor as much. So if you are using this specific file, this may be something that you need to change based on your animation. But if you are using the launch control preset, it should be okay. You could do additional pressure rate. So it's on 30 right now, but if I do 1,000, you'll see it has way more pressure. So it will basically start firing out way more smoke than it was doing before. Kind of looks cool, but I don't think it's very realistic. I must admit, these shots look pretty cool. Imagine if you had like something like this. Ideas. You can also change the velocity transfer. So say a car is moving, you can change how much the emission is being affected by the velocity of the car, which is quite cool. And you can also change the color of it. So you are actually able to render emissions in EmberGen. I've never done it though, not yet. I normally take it into Blender, but that is something that you can do. And it does render a lot quicker than Blender, but obviously you won't have that interaction. But there are loads of videos on that as well, if you want to try it out. Now, simulation, this is sort of a big one. And this is basically controlling how it looks and other forces and stuff like that. So let's go down this list. So for domain, you can see this box is our domain, and you want to set this box just so it's enough, right? And by enough, I mean just covering the areas that smoke is reaching. You don't really want to set the smoke to like miles long because it doesn't make any sense. Now, the reason for this is that domains are basically filled with little boxes, and the more boxes it has is the slower it's going to be. So if I go into my simulation, you'll see right now I have 2 million voxels, but the smoke doesn't look high res at all. Now I can times this by 4 and play it again, and I'm going to need to reduce my pressure transfer so it's not as crazy. But already you can see how much higher res this is looking, right? But it is slower, and we're still getting some voxels, which you can see just on these corners ever so slightly. Having a box which is only utilizing the space that is needed will allow you to get a lot higher res results without really slowing down your computer. Because for example, if I made this box a lot wider, you'll see the voxels go up nearly double, and 300 million compared to 160 million is going to make a great deal like difference. So that's something you really want to be careful for. Other things you can do is you can loop it, so you can constantly have him going in your scene if you're doing something like that. You can increase the flame if you have got flame, and you can also control the dissipation. So you could have the smoke disappear quicker, or you could have it disappear slower. As well as that, you could do velocity speed and like smoke speed, if you want to increase all that. You can actually change the diffusion of the smoke speed, and you can also change the vorticity intensity as well. Now, if you're going to be doing a lot of car stuff, you're going to be playing with the slider quite a bit, as normally cars have quite a lot of spin in their like smoke because of the wheels. You can change the buoyancy and the smoke weight, and this is something that I did quite a lot with this smoke sim in particular, because looking at references of car burnouts, I saw that the smoke actually rises really quickly. So by doing a negative effect of the smoke weight, it actually rose a lot quicker, so I got the effect that I wanted. You can add speed to the wind, so you could actually have it moving. Maybe you don't animate something, but you still want to animate the smoke moving. You can achieve that. You can add shredding, which that's what it does. I've never actually used that. And yeah, loads of other different unique things. Now, after simulation, you don't really need anything other than your export. So all of this is to do with rendering and sort of how you preview the smoke in here. But all you really need now is this volume processing and this export VDB. This is basically allowing you to trim your domain so that if you don't need a certain part, you can trim it just so it's a little bit nicer in your scene. But from there, you just export into VDB, because that's the file that we're going to be exporting here. Set your frame range. So I've set mine to the number of frames in my Blender file, and then set your frame stride. And again, this is just so it matches my frame rate of my Blender scene. It's basically going to be rendering every other frame just so it matches. Now, if anybody has used VDBs before, you'll know you'll get attributes, and attributes are basically telling the software to use a specific part of the volume so that you can either shade something or add density to it in the principled volume. So I exported everything just for the sake of it, just to try it, but you pretty much only need density. So you can tick these off if you don't want to use them. And that is pretty much everything you kind of need to know about this EmberGen file. I am going to be providing it, like I said. And there isn't really much to this. It's just about getting sort of the little things right, and then having it all work together. But now I'm going to show you how you can export it and then put it into Blender, and then basically get it rendering at a speed which is actually doable for people with like medium to high-end computers. So let's get that started. So first thing we need to do is export it. So I'm going to make sure that my quality is set to the quality that I want. So I want it at upscaling 4, and I'm going to save it as burnout 5 because I was doing lots of different tests. So burnout 5. Oh, it looks like there's already one in there. So I'll just save it there, and then I'll press export. All right, so now that's exported, we can open up Blender and get started on getting this rendered. All right, so now we're back in Blender and we've got our animation and everything is looking good. So to bring in your VDB, you just need to go Shift A, Volume, Import Open VDB, and then find the place that you saved it. And from there, I'm going to put in all the frame range that I exported out. So I'm going to press Sequence here in the bottom right, and I'm going to do start from 35 because my exported animation is from 35, and I'm going to do 250 frames. Now we can see it's brought it in now, but the issue is that it's not on our car. And to fix this, you just need to press lift click, drag down so that you can select all of them at once, and then just bring that down to the 0 location. From there, we need to add in our material. And to do that, I'm just going to press new material, and I'm going to use our attribute. So I'm going to Shift A, search attribute, and we can see here we've got all our attributes here. So I'm going to use the density one. And I'm also going to multiply the output of this density node by a number just so that we can get a little bit more density if we really want. So maybe I'll do like 15, and then let's see how that looks. Obviously that's looking pretty much identical to my animation. And from here you can also change the anisotropy, and this basically just rotates the part where light is passing through. So for this scene I went with a negative value just so that we get a little bit more light passing through. And if I scroll across the timeline, we can see how it's looking. And it's looking pretty much identical. Now, to get this rendering a little bit quicker, I'm going to go to my render settings and go to my volume tab. Now, by default, Blender is set at 1 and 1000. And this will produce really nice volumes. but it is still quite slow in rendering. So what I like to do is I like to set my step rate at 0.1, which will make a sort of the chopping of the voxels a little bit smaller. But as well as that, I'm also going to decrease my max steps. And I would say probably do this in the viewport so that it's a little bit less intense, because it likes to crash just like that. So maybe just type it in. So I'm going to try like 50. Actually, let's go to 10 just to see what that looks like. So if you go to 10, you'll see it doesn't look as nice. We're getting some weird artifacts, and that's because we're reducing the quality of the volume essentially. If we bump this up to 500, we'll notice a little bit of a difference in sort of like the edges are a lot cleaner and they're looking way more detailed. Now obviously if you bump that up even more to 1000, you'll probably get a bit more natural effect, but as you can see by my viewport, it's extremely slow, even on a 4090 graphics card. So I think I went for around 150. Here you can see my viewport is way quicker. And it will be the exact same when you're rendering as well. It will be extremely quicker. Now, one other step you can do to take your volumes to the next level is actually increasing the amount of light paths that happen through your volume. So by default, Blender is set at 0, which means that light can't pass through your volume at all, which will give like this sort of very grey effect. But if you just add 1, you'll see how your edges actually get lit up, and it sort of correlates to how bright your scene is and how it lights. So probably only 1 is probably needed. If you go to 5, I mean, it doesn't really make that much of a difference. If you go to 50, really not much of a difference. So I have my default file set at 1, and also I've set my volume at sort of a lower value as well, just so when I am just working and getting stuff ready, it is lower volume rate. What I also like to do is, like, if you're working on a big scene, just rename your volume to volume and then do the step rate that you think you're going to do. So when it comes to actually rendering at the final stage, and say you're rendering your volume separately, you know that you need to set your volume to 350, and that will just future-proof you rendering it. So that is pretty much it. Again, my EmberGen file will be in the description for free so that you can get this simulation yourself. Hopefully you learned a little bit more about EmberGen and how to speed up rendering volumes. If you did like this video, please leave a like, and if you have any questions, put them down in the description, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.